The technicians got it on the first day of the new year. The frost was unusually hard for these southern places. We had to warm up the engines with special stoves. But still the engines started with difficulty. Long turning them with cold compressed air caused fogging of candles. We have to take off, and the engine is running intermittently. I can't get in the air, and I don't want to mess up the takeoff. I'm sitting in the fighter, thinking what to do. I hear Lukashevich's engine running almost smoothly. I leave my car, drop Lukashevich off, and take off in his airplane. Above the airfield I looked for Karpovich in the air. He was not there. I looked around the start. Not there either. There was only my MiG. They didn't have time to remove it. Did the engine fail and he fell? A thought flashed through my mind. Immediately I looked in the field, in the direction of our takeoff. There it was Karpovich's plane, standing like on the landing gear, 2 kilometers from the airfield. On my airplane, the engine still occasionally breaks down. Should I fly alone or sit down? You can't start the new year with a return, you'll ruin the combat mission. Stubborn Siberian character did not allow me to land. I decided to fly alone, to search for enemy targets. On the snow-covered plain well-seen travelled roads, winding between mining villages and towns. Occasionally there are individual cars. The frost has driven all the Germans into the houses. At the station Ambrosievka dropped bombs from vertical dive on the railroad echelons. The anti-aircraft gunners, warming themselves in the houses, missed my strike. They opened fire when I was already leaving along the road to Taganrog. On it, I managed to burn a couple of Skoda cars. I was on my way back. When approaching the front line, I saw smoke and fire from bonfires on the edge of the village. Tankers were warming themselves around them. You can recognize them at once, and a dozen tanks were standing aside. It's too late to be alarmed. From my machine gun bursts, many had no time to hide in the tanks, and how hastily they dived into the hatches. It made me laugh. All the way to the airfield, an ironic smile never left my face. When I pulled into the parking lot, I asked the technician, "What's wrong with Karpovich?" "It's nothing. The engine was badly malfunctioning. He was forced to land. He's unharmed, the airplane is intact." "That's good. I was worried about him." The regiment commander listened attentively to my report on the results of the flight. Then he asked me, "How did your engine work in flight?" On the route, it occasionally gave interruptions. All the way I was shivering, but still it worked. "Why didn't you come back?" "Comrade Commander, I didn't want to let the regiment down. It would have been a failure of the mission." "Wow. A hard-headed Siberian. You'll break your neck someday because of your temper. It's better to crash than to suffer shame." "All right, go. Rest today, Ivanov let me go." I understood from his mood, although he scolded me, he was satisfied that the combat mission was accomplished. One day the daily combat work was interrupted. The regiment was transferred Yak-1 planes from a neighbouring unit. We received a dozen Yak, and their former owners went to the aircraft factory for new ones. Combat equipment, and we did not have enough airplanes, caused joy among the pilots. But at the same time, a little sadness. We received the Yaks already worn out in combat operations. Of course, we also wanted to fly on new airplanes. But there was nothing to do. Whatever they were fighting machines. The 2nd Squadron urgently began to retrain the flying staff. It should be noted that the pilots quickly mastered the Yak-1. The airplane, compared to the MiG, was easy to control in all types of flight, easy to pilot, and had a gun and 2 Shkasa. The armament was not very powerful, but still stronger than on the MiG. A few days later, a group of pilots on new Yak-1s came to our airfield from the rear. Returning to the front, they sat down to refuel with fuel. And before they landed, they decided to surprise us. They began to perform aerobatic figures on the Yak. They could be understood. The pilots were happy to have new airplanes. Everyone in the regiment, with their heads up, watched the performance. At one point, a pair of Yaks flew over us and went into a steep slide. The leader of the pair on the slide tried to make an ascending barrel roll, but he performed this figure ineptly. Instead of a barrel roll, he got a kadushka. This is what experienced pilots call inept execution of this figure. When ailerons are transferred, the nose of the airplane is lowered and the altitude is lost. In this case, the leading pilot went under his wingman because of the Kadushka and was behind him. I saw it and thought, but this is how you can get out from under the enemy's fire when he is in your tail. Lieutenant Iskrin and I thought over and played this maneuver on models, and later, with the permission of the commander over the airfield, began to practice it. Iskrin went to the tail of my airplane and took in the sight. At the distance of possible opening of fire, I fully gave the ailerons to rotate the airplane, made a barrel roll with a descent, and went down. At the expense of the adjusted engine gas, I was below Iskrin by 50 to 100 meters and in the tail of his plane. I gave gas, made a slide and caught my partner in the sight. Nikolai Iskrin and I practiced this maneuver after every combat sortie. We practiced it to the point of automatism and were ready to use it confidently in a real battle with Messerschmitts. Having rehearsed on a straight line, they began to use it on turns. In the following years of the war, this technique saved me from enemy fighters 3 times. In the frosty days of January, in the regiment arrived replenishment, a group of young pilots with the rank of junior lieutenants. At last, the pre-war order to give pilots the rank of sergeant after graduating from the aviation school was cancelled. However, young pilots mastered at the school only flights on I-16. Combat application was not practiced. It was clear that with such training to release on combat missions is unwise. It was required training flights in the combat order of groups. It was necessary to teach them assault actions, air combat. This was well understood by the command of the regiment. It was decided to create a special squadron of young pilots. Someone had to help in their combat formation. One day Ivanov called Pavel Pavlovich Kryukov and me to the control room. He congratulated us on the awarding of the rank of captains, and then began a conversation about the methodology of training young people. The commander decided to consult with us. This immediately alarmed me. This approach threatened that you could be at the head of a squadron of young pilots. Having finished discussing the prepared by the headquarters of the program to put young people in the ranks, the regiment commander said, "Well, you have helped me a lot with your advice. Hear and do the training of young people. The commander of the training squadron, I think to appoint you, Comrade Kryukov, and your deputy will be Pokryshkin. Comrade Commander, you will soon make me a fighter pilot, a permanent instructor," I begged. "Alexander Ivanovich, you already have experience in training young pilots. It is necessary to teach these guys to fight." I had great respect for Viktor Petrovich and did not want to upset him. I did not beg any more and gave my consent. The fact that the commander of the special squadron was appointed Kryukov was also charming. All pilots of the regiment respected him for his calm character, reasonableness. Paul Palik bravely fought on Kharkin Gol. For his courage in battles with the Japanese, he was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. He served as an example and in battles with the Nazis. Having finished formation, our squadron of 10 I-16s flew to the airfield, closer to the front line. Without wasting time, we began to study the tactics of attacking ground targets and fighting with enemy planes. Having finished practical training of piloting techniques and firing at ground targets of flights in the combat order of the group, began combat sorties. Among young people, I liked very much Stepan Verbitsky, Nikolai Normenko, Vladimir Bereshnoy and Sasha Mokolov. I could feel that they were going to be real fighters. They were determined to be leading pairs. Unfortunately, in the first time the frosty and snowy weather interfered with the fulfillment of our plan. It was dangerous to let inexperienced young pilots fly in combat flights in low clouds and poor visibility. In such weather we flew with Iskrin in pairs or alone on free hunting. We destroyed steam locomotives on the crossings, cars on the roads. One day, it was a very frosty day. It was urgent to take off. It was necessary to make a reconnaissance on the road. I didn't have time to put on my face mask, and for that I paid for it. The technician in a hurry could not clear snow from the fuselage. In flight, the flakes swirled around the cabin, the snow stuck to my face and melted. And I was not up to it. I was watching the terrain, looking for targets. And I had to watch the air. After landing, the technician of the airplane, looking at me, anxiously said, "Comrade Captain, You got frostbite all over your face. We must do something quickly." He was grabbing snow with his mitten. But the frostbite was so severe that the Russian method didn't help. By evening his face and neck were terribly swollen. I smeared them with grease on the doctor's advice, but it did not give positive results at first. For several days I had to be bored in the barracks and treated. The cabin on I-16 did not have a hood, heating, and therefore often even experienced pilots froze their faces on frosty days, flying without a face mask. And they did not want to wear it. It hindered the pilot in aerial combat, reducing the view. The separation of our youth squadron from the regiment, frequent bad weather affected negatively. The mood of the flight and technical staff was lousy. Therefore, even random landings of pilots to us when returning from a combat mission made a noticeable revival. Once Vadim Fadiv flew to our airfield. We were just leaving the command post, heading for the canteen. We see an I-16 landing. He taxied over to our group. We all watched as fascinated a 2-meter-tall giant in fur overalls climbed out of the cabin. Young pilots even opened their mouths in amazement. They could not believe that such a huge man could fit in a small cockpit. The pilot's face was all scabs from repeated frostbite, and only by his beard I recognized Vadim. I rushed to him. "What a meeting! How did you come to us?" "I went on a reconnaissance. I ran out of fuel, so I thought I'd come to your place to refuel. Where's your cell phone?" "I've got to get the data back to the division right away." I escorted him to the CP. He passed the information on to HQ. I invited Vadim to the canteen to have lunch, and I went away for a few minutes to give instructions to the engineer to prepare Fadiv's plane for departure. I enter the dining room and see Vadim shaking by the shoulders of the commander of our airfield maintenance battalion. I had to intervene. "Vadim, what happened? Stop it, you'll shake the soul out of a man." "You know, Sasha, he won't give me 2 lunches at once. The army commander himself wrote in this document to give me a double portion." Vadim noisily, shaking in front of the commander's face, a scrawled paper. "Calm down, Vadim. Everything will be fine. We'll feed you heartily." "It's not because of that. There's enough food. Everyone who looks at me carries 2 portions. It's obvious, no paper." We laughed. And Fadiv threw off the top of his overalls. The Order of the Red Banner glistened on his broad chest, and I saw 2 cubes on his buttonholes. "Dear Vadim, I congratulate you on being promoted to the rank of lieutenant. At last they've begun to respect combat pilots. And that's such a fine air fighter and kept in sergeants," I said, shaking my head. After a hearty lunch, Vadim warmly said goodbye to us, taxied off and took off in style. I could not refrain from praise, then told the young pilots in detail about the heroic deeds of this outstanding air fighter. He caused a clear sympathy among our young people, the desire to imitate him. The visit of the regiment commissar brought us special joy. In those days we were supplied with newspapers irregularly, and the commissar did not forget to visit the squadron. He was interested in combat work and life, held conversations about the situation at the fronts and in the country, informed us about events in the regiment, helped us to solve current issues. His visits as if brought us closer to the regiment. True, the commissar was strict. There were unpleasant moments. Once we even got a demerit for disturbances at our airfield. But he always spoke on business. On one of the stormy days, the commander suddenly came to our classes. He was accompanied by Inspector Sorokin. We were just practicing on the schemes and model airplanes to build a combat order of a pair and 4 fighters. The division commander meticulously examined the schemes, listened to the explanations of pilots. Much he did not like. "Is this how it is stated in the manuals and instructions? Sorokin, take the album. Explain how to fight." The pilot inspector opened his album, compiled in the pre-war years. Methodological recommendations were outdated and did not meet modern tactics, but everyone had to listen to the inspector to make notes. In conclusion, the commander ordered to teach pilots strictly according to the guidelines. He flew back to his headquarters, obviously angry. Pavel Pavlovich Kryukov, after looking at the airplanes, returned to the classroom. I went into him, sank down on a chair. "Let's think about what to do," said the commander tiredly. I had already had the answer ready long ago to teach pilots what is needed in battle to fight not in numbers, but skill. Suvorov's rule. It does not age. I understood Kryukov now. He is responsible for the unit, but I knew his character. If he's sure of the cause, he'll insist on his own. Let's see our program through to the end. We developed it on the first experience of the war. It may be wrong, but there is no better, he said firmly. A real commander, a frontline soldier who knows how to draw the right conclusions. Later I thought about those days many times. It was a difficult period. Combat required new techniques, new methodology. And there was no new methodology. The old regulations, old instructions were still in force. It required not only flexibility, but also great courage to teach in a new way. One should be very confident in the correctness of his conclusions, disagree, defend, and assert his thoughts. And he who learned in battle the rightness of the new techniques, who was confident in himself, was able to do it. It was in these days that I had already crystallized my thoughts about the need to bravely adopt new techniques, to throw away the old. So, we continued to teach young people what the experience of combat operations has shown. It was worked out by pilots in battles, not in the office, people who looked the enemy in the eye, not those who saw the battle from afar. In favorable weather conditions, practiced tactics to hit ground targets practically under enemy fire. They stormed railroad stations and concentrations of enemy troops and equipment on the roads. The pilots confidently fired at ground targets. But in the first flights, when meeting with Messerschmitts, they were nervous, huddled together with Kryukov and me. In such sorties I was afraid that my charges could collide in the air. Sometimes they came so close to the plane that I had to take measures. But with each flight the youth grew in confidence and courage. When the Messers appeared, they began to use eras more actively. In such cases, enemy fighters lost the desire to approach and left us alone. For all combat sorties during the period of retraining squadron did not lose a single pilot and aircraft. After a couple of months, having finished the program, the unit returned to the airfield near the Sverdlovskaya mine, where the regiment was based. While we were training the young replenishment, there were some changes on our front. The winter offensive operation was carried out. The Barvenkovo-Lozovaya settlement was liberated. The main direction of actions of our regiment from Taganrog to Donbass changed. This area with densely located cities was very strongly saturated with anti-aircraft weapons of the enemy. With the improvement of the weather, the counteraction of enemy aircraft, including the fighters of Germany's allies, became more active. It was felt that the enemy was concentrating its forces in the Donbass. Our command required increased reconnaissance of this area. In the regiment I again moved from my 16 to my MiG-3. I was returned to the main combat work reconnaissance of the ground enemy. I will not hide, this decision of the command upset me. I wanted to fly to cover the troops. I wanted to accompany bombers and attack planes. It seemed to me that in air battles I could show myself as a fighter pilot more fully. Alas, so far I could only dream about it. Now I am a non-staff air scout, designed to conduct visual observation of the location and movement of enemy troops. I have to say goodbye to searching for the enemy, to fighting, which every fighter strives to do. The command is interested in accurate intelligence data. Therefore, I was categorically required to avoid air battles, carefully observe the movement of enemy columns, the concentration of his forces, disruption of the task, even in the case of a forced fight with enemy fighters, sharply reprimanded, was considered a failure to fulfill the combat task through the fault of the scout. In conditions of clear weather of the past summer, when the regiment had no shortage of airplanes, reconnaissance sorties were made mainly in pairs or links. Reconnaissance was conducted by force. We deliberately or forced into battle with Messerschmitts. Now, in winter conditions, completely switched to single flights of scouts. Bad weather became our ally. It allowed stealthily and suddenly go to the targets, and in case of danger to go into the clouds from enemy fighters or anti-aircraft fire. But such flights required a high level of training, the ability to fly in difficult weather conditions and accurately navigate on the ground, to guide the aircraft by instruments. At the same time, underestimation of the peculiarities of flights in difficult weather conditions sometimes led to severe consequences. In the early fall, did not return from the mission squadron Commissar Fyodor Zakharov, Sergeants Leonid Stashevsky and Ivan Voitenko. These pilots had no experience of flying in difficult weather conditions. It is not known how and where they died. Either they were shot down by the enemy, or they failed to cope with piloting in the clouds. When flying solo, there are no witnesses near the scout. The relatives received reports that their son was missing. But the best pilots of the unit performed their task successfully. I regularly flew on reconnaissance. I mastered this type of combat operations. In such flights and passed the winter. March brought bright sunshine, clear sky. Flights of single scouts in such an air environment outdated. However, the division leadership did not take this into account. We continued to be sent by inertia, by single crews. Meanwhile, in Donbass, where the enemy was accelerating the concentration of troops, there were strong patrols of fighters, increasing power of anti-aircraft fire. In such an air environment, a lone scout sometimes felt simply doomed. If to be objective, then we should, unfortunately, recognize the enemy in the air had a clear quantitative and tactical advantage. When you are alone in the sky and the enemy is after you, the psychological state of the pilot is extremely tense. The sky seems alien, hostile. Next to you there is not even a partner, whose presence would dispel the feeling of loneliness, increased confidence in the success of the combat flight. Visual reconnaissance of camouflaged enemy objects was conducted at low altitude. The pilot must avoid air combat to be able to evade enemy fighters covering the object from the sky and anti-aircraft guns. His task is to actually steal data, truthfully, clearly, and completely report on the results of the flight. All this requires high self-discipline, exceptional self-control, and tactical skill. It is necessary to know deeply the enemy, his forces and means, methods of struggle. You can list many more qualities, without which the scout cannot succeed. Need and courage, the ability to pass through the fire of anti-aircraft guns and machine guns without making tactical errors. A single scout, like a miner, is wrong only once. Subordinate to me squadron, designed mainly for reconnaissance, was staffed by experienced pilots. It consisted of Ivan Lukashevich and Vladimir Karpovich, as well as capable young people who arrived in the regiment a year ago. In the training of pilots, much attention was paid to the tactics of building a reconnaissance flight. In the basis of it, we put the exit to the target at high speed from the side of the sun, high-speed descent at the expense of pre-gained altitude, recognizing targets, leaving anti-aircraft fire on a burst flight. The squadron's combat work was hampered by the shortage of MiG-3 airplanes. This machine most fully met the requirements of the high-speed method of access to the object of reconnaissance. But we did not receive new MiGs in the unit. Their production by the industry by this time was completely stopped, as the engines of designer A. Mikulan were put on the Il-2 attack aircraft. Because of the shortage of equipment, 2 pilots were assigned to each airplane. My partner was Daniil Nikitin. We flew on missions alternately. Daylight hours increased every day. We had to go to the rear of the enemy often. Especially heavy load was put on us after the heavy wounding of Karpovich, one of the best pilots of the regiment. That time on reconnaissance of enemy troops in Donbass, Vladimir flew out in the morning, the first. The time of his flight was not over yet, as suddenly an airplane appeared over the airfield. It was visible that the pilot was controlling the fighter with great difficulty. Anxiety swept over all of us. The pilot made the landing with high endurance, as they say, spit. When the airplane finished its run, the propeller blades were no longer spinning. Everyone rushed to the car, frozen on the landing strip. Even from afar they noticed the shell-torn side of the MiG. In the cockpit they saw Karpovich. He hung on the straps, with his head down. An ambulance stopped next to the airplane. The doctor, with the help of pilots, pulled out of the cockpit seriously wounded Karpovich. He was unconscious. His left arm hung down, blood was oozing from it. Sanitation immediately took Karpovich to the Sanbat. All of us were amazed by courage and self-possession of our comrade. Severely wounded, he still managed to bring the plane to the airfield with one hand, sit down and turn off the engine. Apparently, the sense of duty, the qualities of a real fighter helped him to lead the broken fighter to land it on his airfield. The anti-aircraft defense in the area where Karpovich was flying was powerful, and it was impossible to underestimate it. I experienced its power myself. Performing a reconnaissance flight, I saw a Henschel below, ahead of me, coming, apparently from the front line to the airfield. Having spiked, I went into his tail and launched eras. But it missed the target. I launched the second one again, a failure. Angry, I shot at point-blank range at the cockpit of Henschel. The line pierced the enemy plane. Falling in a steep spiral, he jammed the engine into the ground and froze with the tail turned up. I decided to set it on fire on the ground. I'm descending to attack, but then anti-aircraft gunners opened such a hurricane fire that I had to pin the plane to the ground and leave at high speed. Having taxied to the parking lot, before taking off my parachute, I turned to the technician of the plane. Chuvashkin, why ears go away from the aiming line? Comrade Captain, in a hurry they are sometimes treated like firewood. They deliver them in bulk. And now, look at this, they brought them from the warehouse and threw them on the ground. I went over and looked at the shells. I involuntarily clenched my fingers into fists. On many rockets, stabilizers were bent, so that's why they passed the target. Ordered Chuvashkin not to hang any eras, even with a small deformation of stabilizers, and went to look for the culprits. Saw the regiment's weapons engineer and the commander of the airfield maintenance battalion. Through the fault of gunsmiths today, almost missed Henschel, I said sharply, with offence. I see that some people think that eras are needed to scare the enemy. Is it possible to hit an airplane with bent stabilizers? The officers immediately realized what was going on. Don't worry, Alexander, we'll fix it. Indeed, they did not follow the eras, the engineer bitterly said. After that, gunners and workers of the airfield maintenance battalion began to take more seriously to the rockets. And it had an effect. The effectiveness of firing increased. I managed to destroy several vehicles and hit a steam locomotive on the line. Rockets were very effective. I remember we went on a mission in a mixed group 6I-16s of the neighbouring regiment and our 3 MiG. We were to attack the enemy troops in the area of Chistyakov. When flying to the target, we tried to attack 12 Italian fighters Maki. They went in a close frontal formation. The first to turn around I-16 and let them in the forehead about 10 eras with a remote fuse. The rockets exploded in the enemy formation. Immediately several Maki flashed. Like torches, they went to the ground. The rest of the Italian fighters immediately turned around, rushed to the side and fled. After this incident, Makis avoided our planes. In the spring, to replace the Henschel knocked out by our fighters, appeared new 2 fuselage scouts and adjusters, Focke-Wulf 189. Soldiers aptly dubbed this machine of the enemy frame. The FV-189 aircraft was not fast, but very agile and maneuverable. It was not so easy to shoot it down. Over the front line, FV-189 almost always appeared covered by a couple or even 4 Messerschmitts. For its destruction required skillful maneuver, constraining enemy fighters' cover, surprise attack. Meetings of the regiment's pilots with FV-189 were mostly unexpected. Once such a case happened with my partner Daniil Nikitin. According to the established schedule, he flew first on the MiG assigned to us. There was a reconnaissance of rear facilities, but he returned to the airfield ahead of schedule. He got out of the cockpit, threw his parachute and helmet on the wing of the airplane. I see him standing pensively leaning on the wing console, nervously rubbing his clipboard. I come close, but he doesn't seem to notice me. Daniel, what's wrong with you? Did something happen? I asked him. I lost the Rama, he waved his hand in despair. It's a shame. It was already in my sights and slipped away, the bastard. Tell me how it happened. Nikitin concentrated and quite detailed reconstructed the circumstances of the battle. Crossing the front line, he saw us circling over our front line of defence FV-189. He decided to attack it from the start. The sudden attack did not work. The corrector timely detected our fighter and left the site with a sharp manoeuvre. Nikitin's machine gun burst past by. When turning around to strike again, Nikitin was attacked by a pair of Me-109s and restrained in combat. But Messers, apparently, did not dare to act actively. Convinced of the safety of their charge, They left the battle and headed in a westerly direction. Nikitin, because of the large amount of fuel, was left only to go home. Here at the airplane sorted out the mistakes in this battle. I advised him next time when meeting with the adjuster to attack suddenly at increased speed Falcon strike, and at the same time to take into account the possibility of covering the frame fighters and not to get under their attack. The next day I was the first to fly on Reconnaissance. After me, Nikitin was preparing for the flight. I was ordered by Ivanov to fly to the airfield of the aircraft repair plant and transfer from their repaired MiG-3. Returning, I saw the place where the airplane always stood, empty. Having handed over the brought plane, I approached our parking lot. "Nikitin still on a mission?" asked Chuvashkin. "He has not yet returned, although the flight time has long since expired," said the technician. In his voice could be heard anxious notes. Telephone inquiries from neighbouring airfields replied that Nikitin did not land. From the command post twice requested the aviation units, although it was understood that in the case of forced landing, pilots sought to immediately report it themselves, so as not to cause anxiety in the part. Anxiety for Daniil Nikitin engulfed me. True, I tried not to show my anxiety in front of the pilots, but thoughts about the fate of a comrade did not leave for a minute. Until he returned, how many events can hide these words from a favourable outcome in battle to a tragic end? The lucky ones are those who were lucky enough to land hit or parachute into their own territory. They will return to the regiment, will continue to fight the enemy. That's how it was with me. But more often the words did not return from a combat mission hide the unknown place and circumstances of death. Such a mystery shrouded the fate of Konstantin Ivachov, Ivan Dengub, Stepan Komlov. Apparently we will never be able to reveal it. The evening has come. The fighting day is over. Still no news about Nikitin. From the control room I went into the room where the pilots rested, who arrived to us last year. No one was not asleep. I was met with wary glances. "Everything is the same," I briefly answered the mute questions. I didn't want to think about the worst, I had hope. Late at night, before going to bed, from the control came Adjutant Squadron Medvedev. Received a message from the ground troops. Nikitin and his plane fell on the front line of defence, on the Mioyus. Medvedev's voice trembled. The news was a heavy pain. We all loved Nikitin. A wonderful guy, already an established fighter pilot, died. It was the first loss in the group of young pilots who had to be retrained on MiG-3 in Zernograd. I especially often had to fly with him together. It was a joy to see his successful development as a combat pilot. I was so hopeful that he would grow up to be a real air fighter, that we would have to beat the enemy together many times. At the scene of Nikitin's death was sent emergency team. But the soldiers could not get to the remains of the pilot. The plane went deep into the marshy meadow. We had to work at night, strictly observing light camouflage, and sometimes under enemy fire. The spring flood raised the level of the river, and the water filled the hole, preventing it from deepening into the ground. It was impossible to pump out the water with available means. The crater from the fallen MiG became the grave of Daniil Nikitin. Senior Emergency Team Engineer Squadron Engineer retold us the message of the soldiers of the Rifle Battalion, the location of which fell Nikitin, the course of the air battle. On the frame, which was circling over our front line of defence, suddenly spiked Nikitin. The first long cue ignited it. But then from the side of the sun he was attacked by 4 Messerschmitts. Nikitin bravely and skillfully fought, despite the numerical superiority of the enemy. He shot down an Mi-109, and then, on a crossing course, crashed into the second. The enemy fighter fell to pieces, but also MiG with a beaten-off half of the wing went to the ground. Apparently, Nikitin lost consciousness in the collision with the Messerschmitt and could not eject with a parachute. In life, it sometimes happens that trouble does not come alone. Soon after, Nikitin tragically died through the fault of aircraft repairman Lukashevich. It is painful to die in battle, but it is even more painful when the life of a pilot is ridiculously cut short by the negligence of our own people. Experienced fighter, successfully performing combat missions since the beginning of the war, died not from enemy anti-aircraft guns or fighters, but because of the carelessness of the repairman who forgot the hammer in the fuselage of the aircraft. During the overflight of the repaired airplane, the hammer got under the depth rudder linkage and jammed the control. Lukashevich could not throw himself out of the falling MiG. The cabin lantern did not open at high speed. At the front, even at the beginning of the war, we removed the sliding part of the lantern from airplanes. We knew that it did not ensure the opening of the cockpit in an emergency situation, but the aircraft repair plant continued to install them. They did not count on the experience of the flying staff. The ridiculous death of Lukashevich angered the pilots. We demanded to strictly punish the guilty. The Revolutionary Tribunal said its firm word. But we lost our comrade in arms. In early April, our regiment flew to a field airfield on the outskirts of Krasnodon. None of us at that time, of course, did not suppose that this small mining town would become famous not only in our country, but all over the world. Young patriots, Komsomol members would glorify it with their heroic struggle against the German invaders. In Krasnodon there was an important event in my life. At the airfield, at the airplanes, there was a party meeting. At it I was accepted into the ranks of the Communist Party. A little later, the Regiment Commissar Mikhail Akimovich Pogrebnoy handed me a party ticket. Alexander Ivanovich, you've become a member of our fighting party. Honorably carry the name of communist through all the battles with fascist invaders, through all your life, he said. I will do my best to justify the high title of a member of the Leninist party. Until my last breath I will destroy the hated enemy in battle, I assured him. Ma Pogrebnoy treated me with great sympathy, as well as to all pilots. He took care of us, warned us against mistakes. We all loved and respected the commissar of the regiment. He was a real communist leader, caring, demanding, thoughtful. He had a good trait in his approach to people. He evaluated them by the main indicator fulfillment of their duty, discarding all the petty, worldly things. After relocation to Krasnodon, the regiment concentrated its main efforts on reconnaissance of the enemy in the areas of Golovka and Makiivka. The pilots found there an accumulation of enemy troops. Even the quantitative growth of anti-aircraft weapons convinced us of this. It was felt that the enemy was building up forces here, preparing a strike from here. Once, reporting intelligence data, I did not hold back and expressed my opinion that, to all appearances, the enemy will seek to tie the bag. I, for this statement, as unpatriotic, had to later even give an explanation. Everything turned out safely for me, but the anxiety for the possible complication of matters at the front remained. The events of last year showed the enemy's desire to use any opportunity to encircle our units. Soon Major Ivanov ordered me to fly to Novocherkasska at the disposal of the Deputy Commander of the Air Force of our front, General K.F. Nomenko. It was going to be a long assignment. To transfer me there on UT-4 was entrusted to the commander of the link Iskrin. That day there was a strong side wind. Sidewinder, as pilots say. All the airplanes that flew out on combat missions took off and landed across the runway. Having overestimated my abilities, I decided to take off in the UT-4 on the runway. On acceleration, the airplane turned sideways. I could not keep it from turning and broke the left leg of the landing gear. The takeoff was watched from the control room by the regiment commander. He was very annoyed with my unwise decision and the breakdown of the airplane. Prayed commander, allow me to fly to you, I asked Major Ivanov with a guilty look. Do you see the slag heap? That's Novocherkassk in that direction. Go on foot. On the way you'll gain your mind, think over how to take off in a strong side wind, he angrily replied, and left for the control room. Knowing Viktor Petrovich's easygoing character, I decided to repeat my request a little later. Indeed, having calmed down, he called me, reprimanded me once again, and gave instructions for departure. 2 hours later, Iskrin and I were in the air. Flying to Novocherkassk, I arrived at General K.F. Nomenko. The command decided to create a group on Messerschmitts to perform special missions immediately, said the general. You are an experienced scout, so it is decided to include you in this group. Now immediately start studying the Mi-109, and in the evening we will start flying. And again, reconnaissance. I'm so sick of it. At first there was a desire to refuse the proposed work, but after reflection I agreed. I wanted to learn the features of the Messerschmitt, its strengths and weaknesses. The same later can be used in battles with enemy fighters. I hope to use the Me-109 for free hunting for enemy planes. Besides, there was a desire to test myself in an unusual situation, in a risky position, outside the law. I realized that if I fell into enemy hands, I would be shot immediately. At the hangar stood Me-109 with painted stars on the sides and keel. As it turned out, these airplanes flew 2 Slovak pilots. They refused to fight on the side of the Nazis. Near the Messerschmitts were already the head of the group, Major Telegin, and a captain I did not know. The 3 of us were determined to perform a special task. Technicians, who repaired Messerschmitts, familiarized us with the design features of the aircraft. For several hours we studied in the cockpit instruments and the purpose of tumblers, understood the order of engine control. Then we had simulations. I reported that I was ready for flight. General Normenko gave permission, and I took off on the runway. Having made a couple of landings, I taxied to the start and turned off the engine. In flight and on landing, the airplane was easy to control. I decided that it was not worth wasting any more time on practicing landings. General K.F. Normenko, watching the mastering of the technique, anxiously asked, "What happened? Why did only 2 landings?" "That's enough for me. Let me fly to the zone and study the aerobatic features of the airplane." The general was silent for a minute. Apparently he was evaluating the possibility of such a flight. Takeoff and landing went normally. Over the airfield, I flew the airplane correctly. "Fly, just be careful." Finally, he said, "For a few days in the zone I practiced simple and complex pilotage and became confident to fly the Messerschmitt. I must give credit, the airplane was good. It had a number of positive qualities compared to our fighters. In particular, the Me-109 had an excellent radio station, the front window was armoured, and the lantern cover could be dropped. We were only dreaming about it. But there were also serious shortcomings in the Me-109. Its dive qualities were worse than those of the MiG. I knew about it at the front, when on reconnaissance had to break away from the pursuing Messerschmitts. It was slower to switch from steep dive to upward vertical manoeuvres. These shortcomings I recorded, decided that I would take them into account, building manoeuvres in aerial combat. The first flights on the Messerschmitt caused a lot of trouble. Once, when approaching from the zone for landing, on the circle met our bomber. Its pilot, having seen near Messerschmitt, not paying attention to the stars on the boards, shaking by me the airplane, rushed aside and sat down without fuel in the swamps of the Don. In this connection I even had to fly to Milerovo, to the headquarters of the Air Force of the front, to justify myself. The same case happened with the U-2. True, everything ended with a fright of the pilots, but later in rage they were ready to beat me. Having finished tests and overflight of the 3rd repaired Messer, our group from a specially allocated airfield began to fly combat missions. We went on reconnaissance in the area of Taganrog. There were few enemy troops here, the airfields were almost empty. Nothing indicated that the enemy in this area preparing a strike. The main forces from this direction moved to Donbass, but the danger in our flights was undergone more than once, and mainly from their troops. In order not to meet our fighters in the air, we had to go to the front line and back to our airfield only shaving. It was visible that every one of our soldiers rising from the trench was firing. They could see by the silhouette of the airplane that a Messerschmitt was flying. In one flight, the pilot of our group's engine began to malfunction. It was over enemy territory. The captain turned the plane and managed to fly at low altitude over the defense line. The engine jammed over our leading edge, and the plane landed with the landing gear retracted. He was immediately surrounded by soldiers. "Ah, Kraut, I got him. Get him out of the plane." There were shouts. The pilot did not wait to be dragged out of the cockpit, shouted, "Comrades, soldiers, I am my own. I am a Soviet captain. You traitor. Working for the Germans. Beat him." The soldiers shouted excitedly. Our soldiers hated traitors, and probably the captain would have been beaten badly if an officer had not arrived. He managed to restore order, sent the captain to the regimental headquarters. In the evening this case became known to us by phone, and Normenko, taking me with him, left to free the pilot. Somehow the regiment commander Major Ivanov came to our airfield. He inquired about the combat work. I told him about our affairs, about the test Messerschmitts and my conclusions on the use and combat shortcomings of enemy fighters. Viktor Petrovich listened attentively to the reports, walked around the Mi-109, sat in its cockpit, and then said, "You know what? Give up this mess. Our regiment is being relocated near Lysychansk and soon there will be very hot work there." Indeed, soon managed to persuade General Normenko to let me go, and I flew to the regiment. In the second half of May, the offensive of the troops of the southwestern front stopped. The enemy struck a blow, was advancing to the Caucasus and Stalingrad. The situation on the Seversky Donets became more and more threatening. The Messer epic was over for me, and I, as well as all pilots of the unit, was preparing for new battles in the air. Far ahead showed a village near which our regiment was based. Soon I found camouflaged airplanes standing on the edges of the airfield. The experience of a scout. I couldn't wait to land faster. I looked in the parking lots of airplanes, maybe I would see some of the pilots or technicians. It was good to return to my native part. Here are combat friends. With many of them together had to fly missions, share dangers, fight for victory. Happiness and misfortune in battle walk side by side. You are doubly happy with a friend, and you share the misfortune in half. I wanted to talk to young pilots. They entrusted me to retrain them, to take them to the first battle. The feeling of combat friendship to them turned into a paternal attitude. I couldn't wait to find out how they were, whether the advice helped them. Only now, returning to the regiment, I acutely realized what I lacked while working on Messerschmitts. There were no combat friends there, and how important it is to feel the shoulder of a comrade at all times. When a true friend is with you, you feel more confident and courageous. He will give advice and help you. A lot has been said and written about true battle friendship in the war. There are songs, bylinas and poems about it, and still, probably, it is impossible to express everything in words. When a pilot in a fierce battle, sacrificing himself, covers a comrade, when a technician in the cold night repairs a damaged fighter, there are not enough words to reflect the depth of those feelings that stir the soul. The wheels have touched the ground. I hurried to drive my U-2 to the parking lot. I was surrounded by pilots and technicians. Smiles, firm handshakes, and here I am in the circle of friends. I was asked questions. They asked me about flying the Messerschmitt. They joked about whether he taught me to speak German. I had to beg to be released to introduce myself to the command, to report on my return to the regiment. About the Messer I promised to tell in detail. Technician aircraft Shuvashkin caught up with me. Comrade Captain, agree with the regiment commander. Let them assign me to your airplane. You have always been satisfied with the service. We will fight together, as before, I promised. Major Ivanov met me with a kind smile at the regiment's CP. Well, you're back at last, prodigal son. What should I assign you now? Have you learned to fight while flying a Messer? The commander of the first squadron, instead of Captain Pokrishkin, is now approved Kamosa. The division command will not allow to replace him, intervened in the conversation being at the control regiment navigator Zayev. I'm not going to the post, Kamosa answered him. Comrade regiment commander, assign me to a place where I could fly more. I agree to be even a senior pilot. Will you be Kamosa's deputy? He's been getting a lot of pissed off. And the squadron is led on missions by squadron commanders. It's not right. Do you agree with this position? Of course. Good. Tonight we'll gather the flying staff. You'll hold a class on the peculiarities of Messerschmitts. Yes. Please assign Shuvashkin to me as a technician. Take him along with the plane. I immediately disappeared from the command center. I couldn't wait to familiarize myself with my fighter. In the parking lot at the Yak met me Shuvashkin. I reported that his request is satisfied. He smiled and immediately started talking about the airplane. I listened to him and see a girl in blue technical overalls standing by the wing. And who is that at the airplane? I asked Chuvashkin. Gunnery of your yak. The men of this specialty sent to the tank troops, and instead appointed girls. Take it away. There will be no women on my plane. I'm making up my mind right away, but I say it quietly so that the armory lady won't hear. I didn't want to offend her. I'll pass your order on to the engineer, but the men are all gone. I'm afraid how we might not be left without a gunsmith at all. Chuvashkin spread his hands. I see, looks at me with a sly smile, say, hurried, Commander. All right, let him work. Before dinner we had a class. I began with the tactical and technical data Messerschmitt. I dwelled in detail on the peculiarities of its performance of a number of figures when piloting. I told in detail which of them Me-109 does worse than Yak-1 and MiG-3. With models of planes in his hands showed the performance of certain maneuvers, demonstrated how to get out from under the blow of Messer to catch it. Much attention was paid to the tactics of building combat orders of groups and fighting with enemy fighters. The pilots listened attentively. There were a lot of questions. It was felt that the lesson interested them. In the dining room went together with Kamosa. He started a conversation about our relationship and combat work. Sasha, aren't you offended that I was appointed commander of your squadron? Don't talk like that, Anatoly. The situation now is such that there's no time to divide positions. We have to fight the enemy. I tried to interrupt him. You know, I'm tormented by a stomach ulcer, prevents me from flying. You take into your own hands all matters in the squadron and boldly command. I won't take offence. You know the people there better than I do. All right, we'll work together. Krukov was walking next to us. He heard the conversation. You, Kamosa, stop breaking your diet. Then you won't get ulcers, he said sharply. That's not the point, Pal Palich, I should be cured, and it's wartime. I've already been told today that Kamosa has been complaining about his health since morning. He rarely flies on combat missions. Squadron has not yet become a tightly knit combat team. I was convinced of this in the first combat sorties. Before being included in the combat work on the Yak, and on this fighter I had a small flight time, required training flights. But the thirst for battle with Messerschmitts pushed me to combat missions. I wanted to fight with them in battle. Having learned Me-109, I was eager to meet them to practically check the endured tactical variants of air combat. And I was sure of my ability to pilot the Yak. Besides, each combat sortie would be a kind of training. The morning began with receiving a combat mission to escort the Su-2 to bomb the enemy's accumulation in the area of Krasnoye Liman. Kamosa, having listened to the task, reported his decision. The group will be led by my deputy Pokrishkin. I don't feel well. It was unexpected for me. After all, I do not know the area. In this flight I need to fly leading pairs, look at landmarks on the ground. And later I will be able to lead groups. I objected. And I haven't flown the Yak for a long time. I need to get used to it. Okay, you'll go a pair in my 4 direct cover, agreed the commander. Having worked out the order of escort, we in the cockpits of airplanes waiting for the appearance of bombers over the airfield. We did not have to sit long. Su-2 came up suddenly, appearing from the east, from the side of the sun. A red rocket soared over the control center. The engines started. My pair, followed by Fedorov's foursome, took off. Kamosa, having started the engine, suddenly turned it off. His wingman's engine shut down after him. It was time to take off, and the group without a commander. Someone had to take control and all the responsibility that could arise in flight. But how difficult it was to do it in the absence of radio communication, without agreement on the ground. There was no time to wait for Kamosa and his partner to turn out. The bombers were already on the route. My pair at the start, ahead. So I and take command. We took off quickly, caught up with the Su-2s and took our place in the combat order. Keeping an eye on the airspace, I looked closely at the ground, memorizing the characteristic landmarks on the route. This will come in handy in future flights. Far ahead showed a wooded area to the east of Krasnoye Liman. It was full of enemy troops. The Su-2s came to the target, started on a combat course. The bombs went down. They hit exactly the cluster of enemy equipment and manpower, target covered. The bombers turned around and headed for home. Going with a gentle descent, a group of Su-2s descended under the clouds. My pair followed it. For some reason, the striking wing of the Yaks remained behind the clouds. I threw a glance in the direction of the forest. Smoke columns stretched to the sky, its burning enemy equipment. And then I saw 8 Messerschmitts catching up with us. Pre-combat tension seized me. Approaching, they rushed to the bombers, hoping for an easy victory. Our pair went in front of the leading group of Me-109s. Even from afar, they gave a turn. The trace of fire forced the Messers to withdraw from the attack. Then a pair of Me-109s separated from the 8 and attacked me. My partner V, Berezhnoi, helped me out. He and I skillfully conducted a maneuver as he went towards me and in a frontal attack cut off the enemy planes coming at me. The enemy was persistent. There followed a new attack of 6 on the bombers and a couple on us. With my fire, I thwarted this attack on Su-2. But immediately to the right I saw a trace. It was the Messers firing at my plane. Now they'll take correction. Vigorously performing an uncontrolled barrel roll with a descent. Then I backed the Yak on the slide and hit the belly of one of the Me-109s with a Q. The Q was short because I had to immediately take my plane out of the fire. Unfortunately, my turn was not killing. But the pair of Messerschmitts attacking me left the battle and headed west. There were 6 enemy planes left, a lot for me and Berezhnoi. Enemy fighters continued their attempts to break through to the Su-2 group. We resolutely thwarted their attacks, prevented them from aiming fire at the bombers, and fought back ourselves. At one of the moments, when a pair of Me-109s brazenly broke through to the lagging Su-2, I managed to successfully get to the leader. From a short distance I hit the engine and the left side of the cockpit with cannon and machine guns. Me-109 turned over, smoked and went vertically to the ground. The remaining 5 Messerschmitts and further continued to attack, but now in their attacks was not the same persistence. Hitler's pilots were cautious. Apparently I was shot down by the commander of the enemy group. This had a moral impact on the pilots, led to loss of control, and having met a rebuff, they were afraid. Soon the enemy stopped pursuit and left in the western direction. The mood immediately lifted. Successful reflection of the enemy attack, defense of the Su-2 and the first victory after returning to the regiment relieved the tension. I was happy for Vladimir Berezhnoi. The young pilot bravely and skillfully acted in battle, repelling attacking Messerschmitts. Having driven into the parking lot, I sat in the cockpit for some time. I was resting after a heavy battle and comprehended the experience. In my mind again appeared the whole picture of the fight with a numerically superior enemy, from which we and Berezhnoi came out victorious. The pilots of Arkady Fedorov's wing came up to us. They landed on the airfield much earlier than we did. The flight was easy for them. Seeing on me and Berezhnoi wet with sweat gymnasias, realized that we got, and felt embarrassed. Nevertheless, I decided that I should not limit myself to their worries. For blunders in combat flight, even successful, must be asked. Wrong actions must be paid for in blood. "What were you doing behind the clouds?" I asked sternly. "We're basking in the sun while we were fighting with 8 Messers. Why did you stop escorting bombers? Did I teach you that?" We thought that the Messers will appear above the clouds, and there decided to restrain them in battle, justified Fedorov. Wrong assessment of the situation and decision. You had no right to break away from the escorted Su-2 group. Now I understand why the Ilias suffer losses when you are escorting them. They attack near the ground and are hit by Messers, while you are circling at altitude. From today I'll drive our groups to escort them myself. I demand that you strictly fulfill your task and be in your place in combat order. For violation, I will strictly punish. At the end of our conversation reminded the pilots of the solemn awarding of the Guards banner to the regiment by the commander of the Air Force of the Front, General Vershinin. We now have the Guards badge on our chests, and we must always remember the oath that we took together with the regiment commander Viktor Petrovich Ivanov. We then swore to fight honestly and bravely. Let us hold high the title of the Red Army Guardsman. Looking ahead, I will say that this fundamental assessment of the group's actions became a turning point. By the way, our conversation with Fedorov's wing was heard by other pilots of the squadron who had not yet flown on combat missions. They supported me. In subsequent sorties, we did everything to avoid losses of bombers escorted by us due to the fault of fighters. At the command post, after talking with the pilots, I briefly reported to VP Ivanov on the fulfillment of the combat mission. After hearing the report, the regiment commander asked, "What did you spend so long debriefing with the pilots? Did you arrange a demolition?" "No, I just had a heart-to-heart talk about the honest fulfillment of the combat mission. Such a conversation was necessary. The squadron is feeling sloppy, flight discipline is weak. Don't dramatize the situation. But some measures I think we need to take." To us in the regiment appointed Captain Vorontsov, who has just arrived from the Far East. True, he has no combat experience, but he has more than 1,000 hours of flight time in peaceful conditions. He will be trained in the squadron. For the good of the case, he should be attached to the unit navigator of the regiment, said Ivanov calmly. I realize that such an experienced commander as Viktor Petrovich Ivanov no worse than I know the state of affairs in the squadron. But I did not want someone for me, and the commander made a unit. Zayev is already almost 6 months in the regiment, and has not yet made a single combat flight after thinking, I replied. It is better to let lead groups of link commanders than the chief, who refrains from flying on missions. He will ruin the pilots. Comrade Commander, I assure you that in the squadron ourselves can cope, without Vikings. I'm sure of it too, Ivanov immediately responded. My assessment of the navigator of the regiment soon became known to Zayev from one of the officers of the staff. Probably this is what caused him to dislike me. Zayev arrived in our Guards regiment at the beginning of the year as regimental navigator. He replaced Kryukov, appointed commander of the 2nd Squadron, retrained on Yaks. Outwardly solid, having a long flight time on aircraft in peacetime, he walked important, patronizingly looked at the pilots, liked to give advice on tactics. Unfortunately, focused on pre-war views, relied on the provisions that were guided immediately after the events in Spain. That is why the pilots were somewhat wary of him. Combat reality forced all of us to perceive each person acutely, to evaluate him by the main indicators how he fights. How you show yourself in battle, such an attitude to you will be on the part of the pilots. They did not like such officers who, having flight training, did not go on combat missions, referring to the lack of equipment and finding a job on the ground. During the first months of the war, the regiment lost dead or wounded part of the senior staff. A difficult situation was created, there was no leading, and the battles were mostly fought in groups. As a rule, led groups of squadron commanders and their deputies. Often being in battles, they felt the changes in the dynamics of the battle, boldly made adjustments to the actions of pilots, tactically competent prepared them to fulfill the combat task. We can say that it was from this link in the initial period of the war formed the future major leaders of aviation formations. Meanwhile, the situation at the front was becoming more and more complicated. The defeat of our troops near Kharkov jeopardized the entire south of the country. The pressure of the main forces of the fascist armies in the eastern and southeastern directions was growing every day. The southern front, in order to avoid encirclement, was retreating to Voroshilovgrad and Rostov. Our regiment, based west of Voroshilovgrad, was engaged in intense combat activity in the interests of ground troops. From early morning until nightfall, we flew in groups to escort bombers and attack aircraft, which struck at the enemy troop concentrations and columns. There was a lot of work in the squadron. The commander of the Unit A, Kamoza because of illness, flew rarely. More often I had to lead groups on missions. Arkady Fyodorov, the squadron commander, became a skillful leader. Forming the combat order, we introduced many new things. We finally abandoned the 3 planes and flew in combat order of pairs. Platoons went into battle in 4s. Such changes required the appointment of young, capable pilots leading pairs. This was a reasonable measure. It allowed to form in the battles of young people in the qualities required by the commander of the group. Young people, even without a lot of flight time, were eager to fulfill combat missions. She quickly gained experience, and the most capable pilots became commanders of pairs and links. One of the first showed courage and skill in combat, young pilot Berezhnoi. He was assigned to lead. Before that, performing reconnaissance with him in the area of Slavyansk, met me 110. Apparently, his crew was also engaged in reconnaissance, watching our troops. The enemy late noticed the rapid attack from the heights. Having hit the gunner, I hit the left engine with cannon and machine guns. Black smoke burst out of it, and the Mi-110 in a steep spiral fell to the ground. I began to turn around behind it to locate where it had fallen. Berezhnoi jumped out ahead of me and, shaking the plane from wing to wing, turned to the right. I looked in that direction. From the eastern direction was approaching 7 Mi-109. Apparently it was a flak guarding an important scout. He had missed my strike. Berezhny's warning was timely. If he had been late, we would have been shot down for sure. It took seconds for our pair to turn toward the enemy. Having passed through a group of Messers in a frontal attack with gunfire, I decided to withdraw from the battle. The ratio of forces was clearly not in our favor, and most importantly, we only had fuel to reach our airfield. While the Messerschmitts turned around, we managed to enter the clouds and broke away from them. At the airfield, I built a squadron, told about the brave and courageous actions of Berezhny in a number of battles, appointed him to lead the pair. Comrade Captain, I am still poorly prepared as a leader. Let me fly as a wingman. Berezhny refused. I realized that it was more out of modesty than because of insecurity. You can do it, Volodya, and you will fly your pair in my groups. The main thing is that in combat always follow the rule do as I do, but at the same time show reasonable initiative and do not break away from the group. I had studied Berezhny well, knew his abilities, sensitivity and initiative, and believed that he would make a good pair leader, and later a link commander. I appointed a young pilot, Nikolai Normenko, as a permanent wingman in my pair. In the first joint flight, he acted bravely, correctly oriented in the situation. But it was not without mistakes he broke the commandment of the wingman not to break away from the leader. And the case was like this. 4 yaks of our squadron performed the task of direct escort, and a trio of MiGs, making up a strike group from the 3rd Squadron, covered 2-9 Ilov, flying out to attack. Having received the task at the control center, Kamosa again said to me, Pokrishkin, I don't feel well. I got ulcer again. I appoint you commander of the escort group, and I will go as the second pair in your 4. Remembering one of the previous sorties, when Kamosa suddenly did not take off with his pair, and this made confusion in the group, I thought over my actions in different options. In fact, this time I had to go in pairs in the group of direct cover of the Ilos. Having successfully completed the assault targets, Il-2 stood on the reverse course, and the link of MiG began to process anti-aircraft batteries firing Il. It was diving on the firing points, hitting anti-aircraft gunners with bombs. Just at that moment, a quartet of Messerschmitts came down on us from above. A couple of them went into the rear hemisphere of the link Fidjichov, which continued to dive, not noticing the danger. My wingman Nikolai Normenko broke off the attack of Messerschmitts. He sharply departed from me, drove away the enemy with a line of all weapons and attached himself to the MiG link. At the same time I attacked a couple of Messerschmitts breaking through to the Ilas. They, escaping from under my blow, went steeply upwards towards the sun. Being behind them, I decided to catch up with the enemy machines on the hill, to shoot them down, or to disrupt the attack on the Ilovs with my attack. Already by the end of the vertical realized that my idea is not justified. Messerschmitts, increasingly detached, stubbornly climbed up. And my speed was falling, and I was forced to transfer the plane from the slide to horizontal flight. Messerschmitts, being already above me, continued to gain altitude. This was clearly a new type of machine. It became clear that I was engaged in battle with new, lightweight fighters Mi-109F. We had already been informed about their appearance at the front. The enemy on this fighter put a more powerful engine and lightened its armament to 1 gun and 2 machine guns. Well, the attack did not bring success, but from the Ilov drove away I decided and transferred the plane, his old yak, on the decline. The plan was simple: to approach the Ilas and join the link Fidjichev, to find their wingman Normenko. But everything turned out to be more complicated. Behind me immediately rushed a pair of Mi-109F. It quickly caught up with me. I had to turn around in a frontal attack. The enemy did not accept it, went up towards the sun. Again, by a vigorous half-turn, I went down, made an attempt to catch up with our group. But Messerschmitts decided not to let me alive. They immediately fall down in pursuit. I sharply turn around in a head-on. The enemy pair goes up, taking a favourable altitude for the attack. No, this cat-and-mouse game didn't suit me. A single airplane over the territory occupied by the enemy, with little fuel left, could not be delayed further. If we ran out of fuel, Messerschmitts would be shot as a target. I was lucky that the second pair of Me-109FS followed our group, hoping to catch a straggler ill or MiG. If you want to win, you have to attack, not defend. I decided to use the delayed reaction of the enemy pilots when switching to a vigorous sudden maneuver and the superiority of the Yak over the Messerschmitt when leaving the dive to the vertical with a large overload. Having repulsed another attack, I switched to full speed to descend. The enemy pair quickly converged, lined up in the tail of my Yak. They are about to open fire. I turned the plane and put it into a steep dive. Messerschmitt somewhat lagged behind, but then caught up with me. The most important moment in the realization of the plan. It is necessary to let them as close as possible, but not to miss the opening of fire. I'm watching the enemy, keeping an eye on him. It's time to make a deceptive maneuver. Energetically, with a large overload, I snatch the plane from a steep dive to the vertical. Slightly give a roll for a steep spiral. At the top of the slide, came to his senses from overload, and at the limit of vertical speed, shifted the airplane into horizontal flight, right in front of the nose of my Yak in 100 meters out of the slide-leading enemy pair. I make a small turn, take aim, and give a line on the engine and cockpit. It was accurate. The downed Messerschmitt corkscrewed to the ground. His wingman whizzes away. I'm making a U-turn after him. But the enemy did not take the fight. Messer goes in a westerly direction. I turn around after him, throw a glance at the falling Messerschmitt, see how it crashed into the ground and exploded. Immediately it became easier to breathe. My calculations for a sudden maneuver justified. I achieved victory, I felt happy. After landing, I had a conversation with Nikolai Normenko. Report, why did you break the main commandment of the wingman? My fault, Comrade Commander. I decided to cut off the attacking Messerschmitts from Fidjichev's link by fire and broke away from you. I remind you once again, the wingman in all cases takes a place behind his leader. You did the right thing to join Fidjichev's formation. You alone would have been shot down by the Messers. A loner in an air battle always becomes a victim of enemy fighters. But we can't leave the leader behind. It will not happen again. I must say that Nikolai Normenko kept his word. Later in all our joint flights he performed his task flawlessly and was a reliable partner. In those days I had to fly on combat missions with different pilots, more often with young ones, but sometimes the group subordinated to me included superiors, senior to me or equal in rank. Young, not yet experienced pilots' inept or unwise actions in the first combat sorties sometimes put the group in a difficult situation. But after analysis, deep analysis of actions tried to strictly follow the instructions received. As a rule, in subsequent flights they did not violate the combat order, acted reasonably in combat. But when the group included executives, the situation was sometimes difficult. It is difficult, or rather impossible, to lead the group if in battle, when the success of the case decides seconds, someone replaces the commander, trying to impose and his opinion, his will. This disrupts the plan to fulfill the combat mission, puts the pilots of the group under attack, and leads to losses. In my heart, I was always against the inclusion of senior commanders or superiors in my subordinate group, especially those who rarely flew on combat missions, felt insecure in combat. The regiment commander knew about it. But given the experience in training pilots, instructed me to introduce into the combat formation newly arrived in the regiment Captain Vorontsov. On the first combat flight, Vorontsov went to me as a wingman. The group performed reconnaissance of Hitler's troops in the area of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, as well as crossings on the Seversky Donets. The captain in the air behaved uncoordinated. We could not make a vigorous maneuver to pursue the detected over the front line adjuster Focke-Wulf 189. Then he almost collided with me. At the end of the sortie, the group launched an assault on the bridge over the Seversky Donets. Having broken through the powerful anti-aircraft fire, I hit the cars and pontoons with cannon and machine guns. On the way out of the attack, I looked back at my wingman. Vorontsov did not follow me on the assault. He stayed on top. That made me angry. Luckily for us, during the whole flight there were no enemy fighters, or we would have been unfortunate. After landing at the airfield, I quite sharply dismantled Vorontsov's mistakes. He took offense and complained to the commander of the unit. I received a reprimand for tactless behavior. Soon had to accompany 29 Ilov. They were on their way to strike at the tanks I had scouted. Vorontsov was assigned to my cover group as commander of the strike wing. This flight was very hard for me and for the wingman. On the way to the target, I saw 12 airplanes flying towards us. Because of the long range, I could not determine their type, but I was sure that they were fighters. I decided to warn my own. By rocking, the yak signaled the danger, and the route of fire indicated the direction. After the signal, Vorontsov, to his surprise, led his four behind the clouds. On the cover of 18 Ilov remained two of us with Nomenko. For me, it was clear that at 6 times the superiority of the enemy, this battle for our pair could be the last. The fighters came closer to us. To our joy, it turned out to be a group of I-16s of a neighboring regiment. They were returning from an attack. We continued our flight. Above the target, in the woods south of Krasnoye Liman, the Elis dropped incendiary mixture KC on the concentration of tanks, fired on them from dive guns. At that time, 6 Messerschmitts pounced on us. Leading a group of Ilov, seeing the enemy in the air, increased the speed of departure from the target. Combat order of 9 stretched. This hampered our ability to cover the group. Our pair was throwing, barrage trails disrupting the attacks of Messerschmitts. Using the method of scissors, reflected in passing and strikes on our machines. The enemy was persistent. He promptly attacked the attackers, and Normenko and I are about to run out of ammunition. Then we will not be able to defend not only Isle, but also ourselves will be shot down like partridges. We had to find a way out, to turn the tide of battle. The most correct option, to shoot down the commander of the enemy group. It was not difficult to identify him in the 6. Not paying attention to the traces of enemy fire, I rushed at the leader. He was just adjusting to the retired attack aircraft. Fascinated by the attack, Hitler's ace did not notice the blow aimed at him. With a point-blank fire on the engine and cockpit, he shot down the leading man and slipped out from under the traces of Messerschmitts that rushed to the front. And the Mi-109, bursting into flames, fell to the ground. There was confusion in the enemy group. Attacks lost their former sharpness, and soon the enemy fighters left the battlefield. Everyone fought back. I breathed a sigh of relief. We hadn't lost a single ooze, and Normanko and myself were alive. And then I was so angry at our strike wing, which had gone behind the clouds. After landing, I gathered all pilots of our group to my plane, built them in a line, told them what had boiled up on my soul for the past flight. Vorontsov, feeling guilty, also stood in line. Why went behind the clouds? After all, it was our I-16s. In fact, almost derailed the combat mission. The pilots of the strike wing, realizing that this is the fault of the leader, under my angry look shrugged their shoulders. Vorontsov stood silently, lowered his head. The worst thing in war, after a pause I continued, is to leave your comrades in arms in distress. Komenko, for his courage and skill in combat, I declare my gratitude. And to you, Comrade Vorontsov, I want to say that this was your last flight in our group. The pilots of the squadron immediately surrounded Normenko, began to ask about the combat flight. I had to give an explanation at the control for a sharp conversation with Vorontsov. However, this time I stood my ground, proved that the group commander is responsible for the performance of the combat mission and for the lives of pilots. From the beginning of the workout of the task to the end of the review, he is senior to all pilots, despite the rank and position they hold. They are obliged to strictly carry out the plan and instructions on the conduct of the battle, as well as to perceive the assessments and, if necessary, and deserved reproaches for errors in the battle. The retreat of our ground troops continued, and this affected the increased tension in the combat work of aviation, the increase in the number of sorties. But now Fedorov and Iskrin, reliable and brave pilots, went to combat missions in my group. With them the sorties were carried out successfully, without losses of both attack aircraft and bombers escorted by us, and their own fighters. However, the heavy load led to overwork pilots. This threatened trouble. It was necessary to look for ways to facilitate the actions of pilots in combat flight. One such way was to use part of the escorted group of attack aircraft to repel enemy fighters. The single-seat Al-2 in the units with which we worked did not have a gunner. In the front of it stood 2 cannons, machine guns and rockets for forward fire. This formidable weapon could be skillfully used against attacking Messerschmitts, and the rear hemisphere would be defended by a ground attack aircraft coming from behind. To do this, a pair or 4 ILOV must be well-mastered tactical defensive maneuver scissors. In my group it was often used and gave positive results. With such a proposal I turned to the commander of the assault division, General Getman. The division was based together with us at the airfield. General Getman soon gathered pilots, asked me to tell about the method of defensive maneuver scissors. For practical assimilation, we agreed in advance with the commanders of attack squadrons to hold demonstration training fights over the airfield after returning from joint flights. After the class several times practiced together this maneuver. These and a number of other measures have raised confidence in the attack pilots in the successful defense against enemy fighters. Undoubtedly, this also facilitated the tasks of fighter escorts, increased the reliability of the cover of the ward groups. It also affected the fact that we got to know each other better, and this is so important in joint combat work. Personal contacts allowed us to better and more specifically practice interaction. Despite the great tension in combat work and strong opposition of enemy fighters, our squadron, using the echelon of pairs in height and a clear combat order, had no losses in the air. True, we had an airplane out of service in a ridiculous accident at the airfield. In that early morning in the sky should have gone the first 6, but one of the wingmen had a motor failure after takeoff when gaining altitude. The pilot was not confused. He managed, turning around, to land against the start and stop at the end of the landing strip. And soon we returned from patrolling. Had a heavy battle with a large group of bombers, covered by a strong outfit of Messerschmitts. Unfortunately, the Yak-1 was still standing at the end of the strip, and the landing took place in the direction of the rising sun. Pilot Alexander Golubev, blinded by the rays, did not notice the standing Yak. When leveling off he caught the wing of its propeller blade. Golubev's airplane turned over and hit the ground with a burning wing gas tank. Fortunately, the shoulder straps came off from this impact, and Golubev was thrown out of the cockpit. For about 5 minutes he was unconscious. Then he regained consciousness and was taken to the control center. Zayev, replacing the regiment commander, who left for division headquarters, sent Golubev instead of the sanitary unit to the brig. Learning about this, I entered into an argument. The pilot was injured in the accident. He should be immediately sent to the sanitary unit. He should be punished. He broke a fighter plane. Strictly punish those who did not order to remove the plane from the runway. You have to keep order on the ground. That's your duty. We had a conversation, as they say, on base. The situation at the front was getting worse every day. Our exsanguinated units were barely holding back the enemy's advance. The troops were retreating to the Don. Aviation, leaving the mastered airfields, flew to other, located to the east. Now we were fighting not only on the approaches from the west to Voroshilovgrad, but also in the northern direction, in the area of Milarovo. There, the enemy's tank group was breaking through to Rostov. It was coming to the rear of the southern front. The lack of stable defense, its breakthroughs by enemy tank wedges created an extremely difficult, nervous state. Sometimes we did not know where our defending formations were. Often communication with them was broken, control was lost. The units acted independently. In these conditions, the aviation reconnaissance was assigned the task of clarifying data about their troops. Pilots, unfortunately, were unable to report the numbers of corps and divisions. The front command was especially worried about the loss of communication with one of our tank corps. It was sent to strike at the advancing enemy in the area of Milerovo. And now the leadership did not know where the tankers were. To find the location of the corps was entrusted to pilots of the neighbouring air regiment. Captain Piotr Sereda led his squadron to the search. Flying at low altitude, the pilots found a large group of our infantrymen and artillerymen. They were fighting with the advancing enemy tanks, but they did not find their tank corps on that sortie. In an effort to still fulfill the task set by the command, P. Sereda, having previously discussed it with the pilots of his link before the flight, decided to sit in the location of our troops and learn something about the corps. He found from the air a suitable field near the road where a group of soldiers was walking and landed. He taxied closer to the road. Without turning off the engine, Sereda jumped out of the cockpit, stopped at the wing of the plane. He saw that the soldiers were walking without rifles and without waist belts. This alarmed him. With a wave of his hand, he began to beckon them to him. Suddenly there was a shout from the group. "Pilot, fly away quickly. Germans are here. We are prisoners." Immediately enemy machine gunners jumped out and ran to the plane. Sereda jumped on the wing of the I-16 and jumped into the cockpit. There were machine gun bursts, and immediately there was pain in his leg. Sereda had time to give full throttle to the engine, as burned his left hand. He sharply turned the plane on the spot, knocking down the wing of 2 gunners, and took off under the trails of bullets. Overcoming the pain from the wounds, momentarily losing consciousness, Sereda drove the plane toward the sun, in a southerly direction. Ahead he saw the shore of the Sea of Azov, and on the right occupied by the Germans' Taganrog. Gathering all his willpower, he turned in the direction of Novocherkassk, where he landed the plane in a semi-conscious state. 3 days later, when he came to his senses, he told about the search for the tank corps, the fate of which remained unknown to us at that time. The retreat of our troops was sometimes disorganized. In the confusion, higher headquarters often did not know about the location and actions of retreating formations. This hampered the combat work of our aviation. While aerial reconnaissance reported to the headquarters data while organizing the departure of bombers or attack aircraft, the targets have already moved dozens of kilometers. In these conditions was of great importance was a reasonable initiative of pilots and navigators flying out to strike. Shackling the initiative of pilots reduced the effectiveness of action. Just at that time our 6 went to escort a group of Su-2. According to intelligence, they were tasked to bomb a tank column of the enemy, going along the road from Milerovo to Kamensk-Shaktinsky. When approaching Verkhnaya Tarasovka, 20 kilometers south of Milerovo, I saw on its outskirts a large concentration of tanks and vehicles. I was glad of such luck. I could not think of a better target for bombing. There were also fuel refuelers here. I thought, well, now the bombers will make bonfires. However, to my surprise, the Su-2 group, having passed over the cluster of the enemy, continued to fly along the road to Milerovo. At that time the enemy anti-aircraft gunners came to their senses below and opened fire on the bombers. Large caliber shell of the first salvo hit the Su-2 and destroyed it. The bombers, continuing their flight, dropped a bomb load on the scattered vehicles on the road. They bombed almost in vain due to the ineptitude of the leading group, which did not take into account the movement of the column in the time that passed after its detection. This is the price of formal performance and lack of initiative. We returned to the airfield. To my plane gathered pilots of our 6. I could see by their faces how indignant they were. "Comrade Captain, are the bombers blinded in this flight? On such a group target did not hit indignant Fedorov. In addition, and stupidly lost the plane," added Normenko. "Calm down. Group pilots are not to blame. They should drop bombs on the command of the leader, and he, apparently tight. Stay near my plane and wait for instructions. I think there will be a command to accompany the group to the detected target." I calmed the pilots and left for the control center to report everything and get a new task. We did not have to wait long for it. This time the bosses quickly organized a flight to destroy the target in 29Il. And the enemy column, raising dust on the roads, part of the forces already began to pull out of the village. Isles, dispersed, quickly pounced on the tanks and cars. They acted bravely, decisively. accurately hit the enemy vehicles from low-altitude bombs, rockets and machine gun fire. It was very difficult to cover us going along the road attack aircraft from the possible attack of enemy fighters. And then there was a veil of raised dust, smoke and soot from burning tanks and vehicles made visibility very difficult. But we vigilantly guarded the islas. Having broken in pairs, circled in the sky, carefully watching the air, taking advantage of the absence of enemy fighters, fire-suppressed anti-aircraft guns. Only completely exhausted ammunition, ill-gathered in nines, and took a course home. On the road and in the field were columns of smoke from burning enemy equipment. Such a successful assault, without losses, removed the unpleasant mood of the Su-2 sortie. I could not see the facial expressions of the pilots of our six, but I knew that they, like me, were flying in good spirits. In mid-July 1942, the regiment's pilots were mainly escorting attack aircraft. Often we had to fly to repel enemy air raids on Voroshilovgrad and the nearest towns. The front line was approaching our airfield. We realized that we were working from here for the last days. And this time came we received a command to relocate to Rostov. The first, as always, were the headquarters, advanced teams of technicians and bow. They were followed by the regiment's airplanes requiring repair, temporarily remained for combat work incomplete in the composition of our and the 2nd Squadron. At the end of July, enemy tanks broke through to Voroshilovgrad. This forced us to fly to Rostov.